What is up guys, Mrwhosetheboss here, and welcome to my full review of the Umi eMax. So 2 or 3 years ago, Umi was a name that nobody would have heard of. They've hardly reached the likes of Samsung now, but they're actually working their way up the ladder, and this device is set to change a lot. So the eMax is the company's highest end offering, and coming in at $160 or just below that, it's not exactly the kind of price you'd expect to pay for a flagship, but the experience you get is actually pretty awesome. So to start with, I love the way this thing feels in the hand. It actually has a plastic finish with a sort of metal look to it, and it's 6.9mm thin with basically a flat back. It fits incredibly in the hands. I've kind of come to the conclusion that the flat sides along with the thin build are a killer combination, and one that really elevates this thing's build to a whole new level. It really feels quite distinguished in the hand and really high end. Build quality, although plastic, is really sturdy. It doesn't creak at all and there's zero flex in the body. Packaging was outstanding. It looks really nice, and the included accessories, although slightly on the bare side, were still extremely robust and eye-catching. Overall, the build of the eMax is really quite good indeed. So the features of the eMax. Does it stand out, or does it fade into the crowd of Android devices? So this thing has a 1080p Full HD 5.5-inch LTPS panel. It's really shiny, which I actually think looks nice, but it means that it's not exactly great outdoors. Having said that, it's really sharp. I mean, at Full HD, this is rivaling most high-end devices, things like the HTC One M9. Not quite sort of 2K, but I actually think that's a good thing here. The only thing is that this thing doesn't have the most vibrant of colours. It's just a little bit muted when compared to those devices. Viewing angles here are really a strong point, coming in at about 178 degrees without any real issues whatsoever. Furthermore, it's 5.5 inches with no on-screen buttons, which means that you actually get even more screen real estate. The speaker here is above average, producing loud volume and decent clarity, although it is only a mono speaker. The camera is also good. I mean, the photos do have a little bit more noise than I've experienced with other devices, but it's still capturing up to 13 megapixels of detail here. And while the lens here is hardly the largest seen on a mobile device, you're getting a reasonable amount of light in here, illuminating most of your photos quite nicely and evenly. Colours are slightly on the muted side, but that's more probably to do with the display than the camera itself. We also have a 0.3 second shutter speed, which is not the fastest you can get, but generally speaking pretty fast for something of this caliber. The lens here though is only an f2.2 aperture, which means that you don't really get particularly strong depth of field effects. Overall, the camera is quite good. So for the software, the eMax is basically running stock Android 4.4.4 KitKat. It's smooth, it's fast, but it's not exactly the most up to date, with 2 versions already having been released after this. For those wanting a stock experience, you'll be pretty happy here with very little else included, but for those wanting a more diverse or perhaps personalised feature set, there's very little on offer here. The only extra thing that you have is double tap to wake and gesture support for unlocking with different shortcuts. Now, something the eMax excels at is battery life. This thing has just under 4,000 mAh of juice. That is huge. That's the same kind of amount we'd expect from something like the Galaxy Note, and lasts easily for a day and a half. There's very little bloatware here, and most of the built-in apps are Google's stock ones, which, although you can't remove, take up very little room and are pretty unobtrusive. Having said that though, you're not getting the latest and greatest Lollipop apps with their sort of new flat look and enhanced animations. So now let's move on to the performance of the eMax. Powered by 2GB of RAM and an MT6752 octa-core CPU, this is a mid to high-end device. It scores 42,000 on Antutu, which places it just underneath the highest end phones of last year, which is pretty stellar performance for something costing just under $160. Pretty much every except the most demanding 3D games run at a smooth 60 frames per second as long as they're well optimized, and they look really great on this display. The only games I encountered any frame rate issues in were Nova 3 and GTA, 2 of possibly the most demanding games on the Android App Store. 2D games and 2.5D games, which probably form the majority of the Android App Store, as well as all the sort of basic productivity apps, obviously pose little issue to this device, and it basically crunches through everything. This phone is basically the older brother to the Umi Hammer, a device with a smaller display and running a weaker MT6735 processor, and the performance jump is pretty significant. To be honest, it becomes more and more apparent as you use the device. Scrolling through app drawers, opening up and closing apps, and then just trying to multitask is really snappy on here. It's just as snappy as any lollipop device I've used. The only downside is obviously you don't get this sort of flashy looking animations and the flat look, but then again, that's a sacrifice worth making for these good specifications for a cheap price. Web browsing is not the fastest I've ever seen. I mean, to be honest, it's probably middle of the line, and it's probably a little bit less than what you might expect given its specifications. My suspicion here is that the built-in browser is just weak, and that switching to something like Chrome would yield better results. Apart from the internet browser, this phone feels like a super high-end flagship. It feels like it could just destroy any task you throw at it, whether or not that is actually true. So to conclude, I love the eMax. I love the way it feels, I love its slimness, its lightness, the way it fits into the hand. It really has a nice personality and look to it. I think the display is really quite special. Although it's not the most vibrant, it's not the most contrast-rich display, it still looks surprisingly nice, and I think the neutral palette actually suits me quite well. For some people, I actually think that might be a benefit. On top of that, it can reach a really high level of brightness, about 420 nits, and its lowest level is also very low, which means that it's actually pretty easy on the eyes, especially in dark situations such as when you're reading at night. Furthermore, it's backed by a giant battery, a bigger battery than we see on probably 95% of the devices, which means that this thing can quite easily power through a day and a half to 2 days, depending on how heavy your usage is. I was really happy with the speaker, and I was pretty happy with the camera too, making the overall feature set of this device pretty strong. Also, it's really fast. Just flicking through the UI, you feel like a god with ultra fast response times on offer. But on the other hand, it does occasionally trip up on the most demanding games, and internet browsing is not the fastest we've seen. While it isn't the one and only holy grail which all Android users should tend towards, the eMax has quite a bit going for it and is a device that I can safely recommend to you. Thanks for watching, guys.